I'll let you into a secret. Children are people. They're not replacements for declining congregations and declining numbers. They need to know here and now that they are loved by God, not to replace what's leaving the church already. My friend Sue loves jigsaws. There's nothing more that she likes than the challenge of opening up a new box, preferably with more than 1,000 pieces, and sorting out the jumble. She's incredibly methodical. She's the sort of person who likes to sort out all the edges, to put the sky and the blue all in one bit, to get the corners assembled, because she knows that everything has its place and everything fits. She knows no greater frustration than finding that her 1,000-piece jigsaw has 999 pieces. Because she knows that the aim of a jigsaw is to make it look whole, to be connected, to have the full picture. Today is about creating connections. What I long for, and what I hope you long for, is for us to connect with children and to help children connect with God through Jesus, to connect with Christ's church, and to connect with the family of God. But that isn't going to happen within the straight lines and edges of an ordinary jigsaw. The church isn't a single jigsaw. Imagine if it was different. Imagine if in our churches, with people of all ages, we're growing and connecting differently all the time. If we were open to change and not siloing people or labeling them. So how and why are we connecting? Rebecca Nye has done a lot of research into childhood spirituality, and 3 of the things that she's discovered are these. Firstly, it's innate. If we're created in the image of God, then of course there is a spiritual part of us. She found in her research that children of all faiths and none had a sense of the other. She also discovered that it was every day, that they didn't put it into a Sunday box or a Saturday afternoon messy church. It was just there. But perhaps more scarily, she found that it was endangered. Every child, even those who went to churches and was good Sunday school people, thought it was something they would grow out of because nobody had connected with them about it. Their churches hadn't talked to them about the spiritual life. They had no idea that adults too connected with God. So where and how might we strengthen these connections? This Sunday is Godparent Sunday. Some of you may be keeping it. Some of you may be aware of the Christenings project that's been going on. Baptism is one of the ways that God imparts God's grace and that we're connected into the wider family of God. How do we connect in those families that we sometimes just dismiss as using us? How do we keep the promises that we make to connect them with the life and the story of Jesus, to help them know that they and their children are loved by God? One of the things that the Christenings Project found was that parents who weren't connected to church but came to ask for christenings expected the church to keep in touch with them. And most of them found that it didn't. Most of them found that it didn't. But the parents were on their own journey of connecting with something that they knew was bigger than them. But the church wasn't helping them to see that that was God. And then we have the opportunities that we saw in that wonderful video from St. Mary's Yate, connecting in the early years. Some research that I commissioned at the end of last year was into the early years opportunities in our churches, to look at our toddler groups and ask, do we recognize as these being missional opportunities to connect with children and with their families? Again, a lot of the parents who were spoken to said, I know nothing about the Christian faith, so I'm very glad that we sing songs and have prayers here, because I want my children to be able to have a choice. Some even found that they discovered a choice and that they chose God. Our early years opportunities are a chance for us to connect parents and carers with faith and with faith practices and offer them ways to take those into the home. And then we can connect through worship. Joyce Mercer said, "We're in danger of growing children who cannot worship alongside adults and adults who cannot worship alongside children, because so rarely do we bring the two together." But worship isn't about our personal preferences. It's about coming together as that jumbled body of Christians in God's presence. Worship must always be God-focused, but we cannot have it as being disconnected from children and young people, and we must not disconnect them from it. Perhaps most importantly, we need to connect through relationship. Our God calls us into relationship through Jesus Christ and calls us to build relationship across ages and across boundaries. You don't have to do an awful lot to build a relationship with a child. You basically just have to smile. That's all you have to do. They don't want you to engage with huge conversations necessarily, but they do want to know that you're glad they're there. They do want your welcomers to offer them the hymn books and the service sheets and anything else, even if they can't read them, because that says you're welcome here. And I want you as part of this place. But we can't build relationship if we're not having people meeting together. And so we need to connect as well through our whole community. We need to look wider than peer groups of thriving youth groups and thriving Sunday groups. We need to be able to connect our children and young people into the community of the church in all that it's doing. It's building projects, it's fundraising, it's prayer life, thy kingdom come. And then we also need to connect through leadership. There was a conference recently about children as leaders and ministers in the church, and one person stood up and said this: "When I was much younger, I think I was seen by the adults as an inconvenient child that just talked in the prayers or ran up to communion. I remember wanting to join in, but it was hard, for the service was full of words and no pictures, and I couldn't see properly, and people sometimes turned round and glared if I made a noise. A lot of churches don't take children seriously. They treat children as just in the way of the people who are proper Christians. When I was preparing for communion, I finally felt part of something real, that I meant something to God's family. I was finally starting to feel that I belonged in the church community. And taking communion was something that the adults had always done. Being able to do this myself made me feel like I actually belonged to God and to the church. These experiences changed my faith so much. When I felt like I was being taken seriously, it meant that I was finally enjoying praying and singing to God. Church wasn't just a commitment anymore, it was a major part of my life. I don't know if I'll be a vicar when I grow up, but it isn't about that. It's about belonging." That 11-year-old then went on to talk about the different ministries that she had in her church. That 11-year-old is now 13 and preaching sometimes in her church. That 11-year-old is discovering gifts of leadership that are connecting her to Christ and Christ's body here on earth. Sam said, and I'm going to have a T-shirt printed with it on, that the job of youth work isn't to be more interesting than God. There are dull bits in the Christian life when we meet together in churches, such as the APCM. The photo that I hope is behind me at the moment was taken on Sunday. My friend Margaret, who is one of the volunteer youth leaders at this church, knows that there are dull bits in church and there are routine bits in church as well as the exciting stuff. But actually being connected with church involves us engaging with those dull and routine bits. So she invited her children and youth group to the APCM. And she didn't expect them to pay much attention. She discovered that as the vicar went through his report, they were going, "I remember doing that." Or, "Look, there's a picture of us when we were involved." They connected with this wider picture. One 9-year-old was delighted with the accounts. I have to tell you that his mother does edit the money section of the Sunday Times. So he is fairly financially literate. But he was telling the other children, look, we don't have a deficit budget, and look how much money our church gives away. Isn't that good that we're doing what God wants us to do? And as for when it got to the elections for the Deanery Synod, she said they were on their seat edges because she'd told them that these were people who got involved in the real decision-making, who had the chance to talk about LGBTI issues, who got the chance to talk about things that made a difference, and they wanted to know that the people representing them were the right ones. Might not have been able to vote, but they were certainly connecting with their church community beyond just hearing Bible stories. She whispered them through the process. She mentored them through the process. She helped to connect them with God and God's church and the community of which they were part. We asked some young adults who are still connected to the church and who are still strong in their faith what it was that they felt had helped strengthen those connections. This is what we heard.
Seeds need good soil to turn into thriving plants. So we asked, what helps the seeds of faith in young people root, grow and flourish? How can we be good soil? Here's what we heard. Inclusion. There has to be some way of getting us to be part of a whole family. Young people told us they value peer groups and activities, but don't want to be separated from the main church. Intergenerational relationships are vital for faith to flourish. Equality. I was treated really maturely, really early. I was valued as a person, not just the token youth. We heard that faith flourishes when there is the chance to put it into action. Young people want to be heard in decision-making, included in leadership and service, and help to make a difference in the church. Space. Adolescence brings plenty of upheaval and questions. Young people told us of the importance of safe space to voice questions, to be welcomed and accepted, and not to be judged. Young people need to know that they are not on their own. They need to know that there is a raft of love on which they can float until they reach a shore. Leadership. Just being hip and cool isn't effective. Young people want genuine, meaningful experiences and relationships. We heard of the importance of direction and positive role models, of youth leaders who build bridges and develop relationships with the wider church. But youth leaders need support and to be part of the church's vision and strategy. Improving the soil of the church doesn't take huge amounts of money or large congregations, but it does require work to clear the stones and thorns which stop the seeds of faith rooting. It needs congregations to work together to create good soil so that young people grow and flourish as active disciples of Jesus Christ in this and future generations.
Heidi's right. Most of us can't start from scratch and choose the children and young people that we'd like to be in our congregations and choose the adults that would like to be there. Most of us have to put up with the frustrating, energetic, sedentary, delightful, and annoying people that we've got, each of whom is enjoyed by God, and God enjoys them and loves them. But what we can do is not silo children in the way that they will not connect. We shouldn't try to force them into places where they don't need to be. We need to be able to see them fitting into different places at different times. They grow and change. Their gifts and skills and abilities grow and change. That 2-year-old who dances up to the altar will become a 13-year-old sulky adolescent. But in between might be the 7-year-old who desperately wants to read the Bible in church out loud, or a 10-year-old whose prayers are just wonderful. We need to find our connections. We need to find our identity in God, within God's church and amongst God's people. But that requires us to change. Sam said, learning to enjoy God and enjoy others is what we're all about. And that calls us as communities to change. It calls children and young people to change as well. It calls us to be ready to move, to give up those positions that we love so that others might take them on. It calls us to allow children to grow and to change, to move and to make new connections, and perhaps even be the connection that holds our congregation together. Connecting with children isn't about large numbers. It's not about lots of money, and it's not about belonging to a particular tradition of the church. Nor is it just about knowledge, skills, and having lots of really good groups for children and young people. Connecting with children is about building relationship across the generations, about including them in every part, the duty and the joy of our congregational life. And it's about us being willing to change and not tut because a 1-year-old dares to be a 1-year-old. We must try to make sure that FOMA, fear of missing out, isn't prevalent in our churches, but this is the place where they want to be, because this is where they will get what they can't get anywhere else, where they're connected, connecting, and count amongst God's people. Charles Wesley said this: "To those who would be Methodist preachers, where there are 10 children in a society, we must meet them at least an hour every week, talk with them whenever we see any of them at home, pray earnestly for them, diligently instruct and vehemently exhort all parents at their own houses. Some of you Methodist preachers will say, 'I have no gift for this.' Gift or not, you are to do it, or else you are not fit to be a Methodist preacher. Do it as you can, till you can do it as you would, and pray earnestly for the gift, and use every help God hath put in your way to attain it." It's our responsibility, not somebody else's, to connect with children and to connect with young people. It is not for us to leave it to the experts or those whom we can afford to pay to do it for us. They are fantastic, but they are only part of the way of connecting children with God, the church, and the community. We, children, young people, and adults alike, must be able to connect together. And that doesn't have just one shape, but it does mean that we must let the children come to Jesus as he asked, and we must each do it as we can until we can do it as we would. And we've got to be ready to change the church.
Fantastic. So I am your second half. You can decide whether I'm better or worse. It's okay. So I had the joy of being the fairly newly appointed National Youth Evangelism Officer for the Church of England, which is a title which sounds way more impressive than it actually is. And one thing which is probably the number one question which I'm asked is evangelism. That's a really interesting word. What do you mean by evangelism? And essentially what they're trying to figure out is, am I trying to convince everybody to be the new J. John? What I think is really interesting is if you ask people, what do you think evangelism is? And especially this is fascinating when you speak to young people. Because I think if you were to ask young people to define evangelism, broadly speaking, they would come up with 3 different illustrations. And I think for most of us, we'd probably come to the same 3. That ultimately we would come with some idea of J. John, Nicky Gumbel, Billy Graham. Somebody stood on front of a stage, maybe with an American accent, in front of 10,000 people saying, if you want to give your life to Jesus, I want you to stand up and I want you to come to the front. The second would be a vicar, maybe a youth worker if you were lucky, who speaks on a Sunday in front of people and tells them about Jesus. And the third is the man who screams outside your whatever station it is that you're near. These would probably be the 3 models which most young people would think of when they think of the word evangelism. And I think when most people ask me, what do you mean by evangelism? These are one of the models which they're thinking of. However, I think one of the definitions which I've come across, which is probably the most helpful, is that evangelism is people knowing more of Jesus when they leave you than when they met you. That ultimately, evangelism isn't about just that proclamational altar call, but it's about so much more than that. I think that probably one of our biggest calls, and especially when it comes to talking about evangelism amongst young people, is looking at how do we redefine what we mean by evangelism. And so I have 12 minutes to talk, but as a born preacher, I have 3 points to get through, okay? So we're going to do this quickly. So 3 points. The first one, which is about changing how we define it, is who can do evangelism. I think we need to rethink this. The second thing is what success looks like in evangelism. And thirdly is what evangelism can practically look like. So, point number 1, who can do evangelism? Now, I think much like most youth work, most of us in our heads have got a fairly preconceived idea of the kind of person who we're looking for. Really, we're looking for somebody maybe in their 20s, somebody who owns an excessive amount of hoodies, somebody who has a good grasp on youth culture, is fairly good at playing Halo on the Xbox, and is able to be fairly nifty with a football. Then you are qualified, then you are good, you are able. For me, I can give you 101 reasons why I am not that person. Okay? I think we need to radically change that. I think when it comes to evangelism, again, we have a very preconceived idea over who can do that. It's people who are gifted with words, people who can stand on a stage, people who have been doing this for years. That ultimately is people who have a platform. But you know what? What's really interesting is that if you go to your Bibles, because we're all Anglican, it's a good idea. So if you have your Bible, you can turn that on, and you can go to John chapter 1. As I am now. John chapter 1. And what's really interesting is if you go down to verse 41, so where Jesus begins to call the disciples, what I find is fascinating is what happens immediately after that. So, verse 41. The first thing that Andrew did upon Jesus calling him was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah. This is the Christ. A couple of verses on later, 43. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said, follow me. Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethesda. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nazareth, can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked. Come and see, said Philip. Now, what's interesting there is that none of them decided that what they really needed to do was go off, do a theological degree, learn all the answers to all the possible questions which they could, and when they felt confident enough and there was the right opportunity, then they would share it. The first thing they did was that they found a friend. They found the people who they were surrounded by, and they said, come and see. What I think is really interesting, there was a big bit of research which was done last year called Talking Jesus. If you haven't seen it, Google it, it's amazing. In which they basically asked a whole bunch of questions to the people who were talking about their faith and the people who were being talked to about faith. And there were some really interesting results. One of the most interesting ones, 44% of practicing Christians credit their friends for introducing them to Jesus. That's nearly half of us. Just by a quick show of hands, how many people here came to faith because a friend spoke to you about Jesus? Right? That's a lot of us. But if we can get the next slide up, what's really interesting is then when you ask those same Christians how they feel about sharing their faith with their friends, 23% of practicing Christians feel unable to take up the opportunity to talk about Jesus, 33% are afraid of causing offense, 35% believe that someone else is better suited, and 23% don't know how to speak to others. That ultimately, one of the best ways that we have to be able to share Jesus is with our friends. I'm a passionate evangelist, not just for Jesus, but for Apple as well. I'm not talking about those things we had at lunch. I'm talking about Steve Jobs' Apple. I'm a strong believer in Apple. Is there anybody else who's with me? Yes, that's wonderful. It's good. If Jesus used a PC, I wouldn't believe it. However, what's really interesting is I will happily tell you, regardless of how tech literate you are, regardless of how avid a PC fan you are, I will tell you all about my love for Apple. But what's interesting is the way that I tell you about my love for Apple. I don't sit there and go, you know what, guys, I've got this great iPhone. It's got a 16 gigabyte hard drive, and it's got the 7-inch screen. Because you've all just switched off The way that I sell Apple to you is I go, mate, check my phone. Like, look how easy this is. You have a go on this. Like, look at this app. This is incredible. It's experiential. I don't talk about the specifics. I don't know the specifics. What I talk about is how having an Apple product has changed my life, how it has transformed how I do everyday tasks. And I invite you to have a go yourself. And ultimately, what's interesting as well in that is that if you walk away from that, and that very second you haven't gone, Jimmy, stop what we're doing, I need to go to the Apple store now and I need to buy a phone. If you walk away and go, you know what, I'm going to have a think about it, I haven't failed. You know, if you walk away and you're an even more avid PC fan, again, I haven't failed. My role in this is to share how amazing I think Apple is and how it's transformed my life. But what's interesting is we do evangelism when it comes to Jesus completely differently. That we talk about evangelism, and especially evangelism to young people, as I've got to know all of the answers. I've got to know all that kind of tech stuff. And when I have all of that, I will present that as a logical argument. But actually, if we look, what we find is that evangelism through the Bible is come and see. So what I want us to do, I've lost my notes, there we go, is I want us to reimagine today, when it comes to who can do evangelism, especially evangelism with young people, that it is any of us. Not just people who are called to ordained ministry, but anyone can do evangelism with young people. I want to show you a brief video of two of my favourite people who I've met recently. So this is a short video of Diane and Beryl.
Hello, I'm Diane.
And I'm Beryl, and we both do youth work in the Winchester Diocese.
10, 11 years ago, when I worked in a little shop in the village in Burley, the kids used to come in there and buy their sweets and their toys, and they'd say they were bored, there was nothing going on in Burley. And although we had some children in our church, there wasn't a great deal on offer there for them. I went home to Beryl and we were talking about it, and Beryl said, why don't we start a youth club? We put all our courage in, well, one hand, we didn't have enough for two. And we put posters up around the village saying for young people, say from 10 to 18, to come along and tell us what they would like in the village, what they would like us to do if we could help them. Worried that nobody would come, but they came. And it's just really gone from there onwards, you know.
We decided amongst ourselves, talking to them as well, that we were going to call ourselves YOBS, which was Youth of Burley.
And they were all saying, can we do this? Can we play football? Can we do craft? Can we do swimming? Can we go camping? Can we go on holiday? Can we, oh my goodness.
We're probably a bit sort of worried that we weren't actually getting the message over too much about Jesus. Bishop Paul Butler was our suffragan bishop at the time, and he told us not to worry, you are sowing the seeds, and it's not up to you to wonder when God's going to bring this to fruition. You just sow the seeds and you're doing the right thing. So that's what we've done ever since, isn't it?
It can be difficult, but very, very rewarding, extremely rewarding. Give it, I would just say to anybody thinking about it and thinking they can't do it, believe you man, you can. Pray about it. You will know if you're being called to do it, because that's how I personally feel I was meant to be doing this with Beryl. And that's why I think it's been a success.
So, misconception number one, who can do youth evangelism? It's not just J. John and Nicky Gumbel and Billy Graham, and it's not just 20-something-year-old qualified youth workers. It is anyone who has a heart for young people, anybody who loves Jesus and who can say, come and see. Ultimately, I think we need to realize within all of this that evangelism is about a journey, and it's about inviting people to journey that with us. So, point number 2, promise you 3 points. Point number 2, what does success look like? Again, I think so often when it comes to evangelism, we define success as looking like crossing the finishing line. It looks like somebody saying the sinner's prayer and you're in. Tick, there we go, that's a point. But actually, I think if we redefine this quite dramatically, one of the things which I love is, if we can get the next slide up, how many people have seen some version of this? Good. If you haven't, I've got a complete blank on the name of it. How awful. Engels scale, there we go, that's a good thing to write down, wouldn't it? Engels scale, which Engels basically argued that it wasn't just a binary, it wasn't a 0 and a 1, but actually people were on a journey. It was like a ladder. And ultimately, I think so often we look at having rung 1 and we look at having rung 10, but we forget that there's a whole bunch of rungs in between. And actually, our journey with young people might see us move from having a young person who's at -7 on this scale to then being on -5. And that's a success. That's good. That's seeing young people move closer towards Jesus. That is evangelism, as much as seeing a young person move from -1 to 0. Obviously, we long to see young people come to know Jesus. We long to see them make a decision to follow him. But ultimately, that's not our job. That's Jesus' job. It's Jesus who's going to take them on that journey, and actually we get to be part of that. But our part might just be moving them one step further on that. I think for me, one of the things which is really frustrating is when I go and meet with youth groups, and I find that there are two different types of youth group that we have. We have one group at one end, which is the detached group, where we're going to reach out into the community, and we're going to be nice people who meet in a church, we play table tennis, and we drink hot chocolate, and we do holistic relationships, and we talk about good decisions. And at the other end, we have a group who meet on a Sunday morning normally, and we do discipleship, and we talk about Jesus and what it means to follow him. And actually, one of the most interesting questions is, well, where's the middle gap there? Because ultimately, you're saying we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff with guys who are on +3, and we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff with people who are on -7, but actually we don't know what that middle section looks like. That actually success looks like, how do we move young people to whatever that next step is, that next step on the ladder? Because ultimately, evangelism and discipleship are intrinsically linked. You can't take one without taking the other. That it's about how do we help young people to discover more and more of who Jesus is and how they can have a committed relationship following him. So point number 3, which is the one which are all on bated breath. What can evangelism practically look like? And I want to suggest 2 different ways that you could do this. So rather conveniently, the first way which I want to suggest is using prayer. So there's a story which I heard, which I have told multiple times going around the country, and wonderfully, it is a story from the youth worker at this church. So it all feels very local. But I was chatting to Joel. For those who don't know Joel, go and pester him afterwards. He's left the room. He's embarrassed. He's run away. And I was talking to Joel, and he was saying that so often, oh, he's there. He's run to the back. That's okay. And he was saying that so often what we find is when it comes to evangelism with young people, that we kind of have a couple of different approaches. That normally we have the God slot, that we have a kind of 5-minute, 10-minute slot, of which 9 minutes is sit down, shut up, give me your phone, you sit next to him, get out, and actually that doesn't give you the best image of Jesus. And so instead, Joe was telling me that they decided they were going to axe the God slot. And instead, as a team, they were going to commit that any time any young person gave an opportunity to pray, that they would pray for it. It's really interesting that so many of us would pray before a youth group session where we lock the kids outside and we come inside and we pray, almost like prayer is something which is separate from them. But actually, this opportunity opened up a whole bunch of opportunities for young people to want to discuss faith. Probably starting with things like, why do you keep praying for us? And do you actually think this works? And have you ever actually seen it actually do anything? But Joel was saying that one of the breakthroughs was when one of the young people came back in and they'd prayed for, I think it was a mum, let's go with mum, that's good. And this young person had come back in so excited because something had happened. And actually the knock-on to this is that conversations were happening about faith, but conversations which were initiated by young people. I suppose my challenge to you is, how often do we have an opportunity to pray with young people? And actually what's exciting about that is that's not about me knowing the answers. It's about me introducing you to the person who has the answers. It's not about me coming and offering you a solution. It's the same as the apple analogy. It's come and see. It's come and meet the person who can solve your problems, who can give you eternal life, who can change your world upside down. And the second way which I want to talk about is through using story. Ultimately, I think when we talk about story so often, we talk about it in the form of testimony. We talk about it, so I became a Christian at 18, so 0 to 18. You know what? 18 to 30 is a way more exciting story than 0 to 18. I remember once telling my testimony to a group of young people. One of the young people came up to me afterwards and said, Jimmy, that's amazing. I'm going to do exactly what you did. And I was like, brilliant. He's going to become a Christian. It's going to happen. Come on. And he said, I'm going to do exactly what you did. I'm going to wait till I'm 18. I'm going to do what I want. And then I'm going to become a Christian when it's boring. I think so often we inadvertently, that's the message that we give. The people who we put on the stage are the people who have the really big, impressive story of how I was a heroin addict and Jesus appeared to me in a blinding light. And that's an amazing story, but actually, story is just about as much about what has happened in this current week that has let you know that Jesus is alive. For most young people, the thing which they're trying to figure out is, does you following Jesus make any difference in your life other than you having to give up an hour and a half on a Sunday morning? Because if it's just about sacrificing an hour and a half to sit in a boring church service, I'm not interested. But you know what? If it actually makes a difference, if it actually does something, if there's something real to this, I want to know about it. And the way which we tell people about that is through story. Something my mentor asks me all the time is, what has happened this week that has made you fall more in love with Jesus? How often do we tell those stories to young people? Those stories that let us know that Jesus is real and that it is worth following him. So there's 2 different things. I could give you 101 others. But I want you to think today, what is there that you could be doing that would help with youth evangelism with your young people?